some thinking that I've been preoccupied with for more than a decade. In fact, it began when I engaged with studying the Baiga tribal community, and I find that in my reflections on questions of Indian identity, I keep returning to that experience as one of the most formative, transformative field experiences that I have ever had, of actually living among Indians who are culturally so distinct and different from mainstream Indians who are integrated into the hierarchical caste system that all of us are familiar with. So my talk today is based on the reflection on the need for culture in human formation and what schools need to do about it. Many years ago, when I was preparing to study learning within the Baiga tribal community, I read the MPhil dissertation of a friend, Amrita Patwardhan, who was researching educational experiences of Adivasi children displaced by the Sardar Sarovar Dam construction in Maharashtra and Gujarat. Amrita noted that other than the schools that were run by the Narmada Bachao Andolan, there was a cultural disconnect as far as tribal children are concerned. Schools seem to have no reflection of their culture in it and seem to be distanced from their culture. I think we can all immediately relate to this finding. It's consistent with our expectation, based on common sense knowledge, that tribal culture is not a part of mainstream schooling. What marks tribals in our minds is the distinctiveness of their culture. This begins with their external appearance and exotic dressing even in contemporary times, to their ways of life, such as the centrality of communal dancing, the simplicity of their lifestyle, in close relationship with nature and forest. They seem to merit distinctive treatment, not because they are poor, which most of them are, but because their culture is distinctive and in danger of being lost if they're assimilated into modernity through schooling. Our intuition tells us that the difference is more than material and appearance, and that this difference lies in the realm of the symbolic world that they inhabit and which gives rise to their distinctive way of life. It is this symbolic world which is culture, manifesting in material ways, such as the lack of possession, being self-reliant to meet daily needs except for cloth and iron, but more importantly, in giving meaning to life and giving rise to a distinctive way of life. This culture provided the Baiga with their framework of values, such as wanting less, doing with less, valuing independence from early age, a particular aesthetic taste and sense of beauty, and in matters of, and even in relationships such as child rearing being a community activity, and of negotiating encounters with new ideas and sources of power through hybridity and hybridization as a way of assimilation, and ability to bracket out community whenever it was, when they could not hybridize. It made them predisposed to wait for others on occasions and to accept wide variation in norms of practice. I particularly remember an occasion in which a gathering had to start its proceedings at 12, which is when the sun is overhead. But the whole community just waited and waited and waited for one particular musician to come, who came when he was ready. And then when the group started playing music together, I was astounded by the cacophony of sounds, but they completely accepted different norms of perfection in the practice. So this, in my mind, these are the elements that defined their culture and gave it its own distinctive characteristic and way of life. And it created the predispositions that they had through which they negotiated encounters and dealt with the world. It also included ways in which they valued themselves and valued others. It was the basis of motivation and attaching significance to events. These are the resources which accrue through culture, and why culture, as world-making, is so essentially constitutive of human formation. It's not only true of the Baiga, it is true of all human formation, that we need culture, and culture enables us to be fully human in these ways. These are the kinds of resources that it gives us. Mostly we don't notice it because it's like a fish when in water. We don't see the water in which we are swimming. But when you have an opportunity to observe another culture, you become much more aware of what it is that makes that life form possible. Acquiring this is what it means to have and grow in a culture and to grow into a culture. All humans have and need culture, but it is the particularities of culture that carry its distinctive constitutive character, accounting for the specificities of tastes, values, and practices. Why, for example, obedience may be valued in one culture, but independence may be valued in another. Why the movements of Bharatanatyam might appeal in one particular culture, while in another culture the movements of Yakshagana are attached as having aesthetic value. In her book, Need for Roots, the philosopher Simone Weil passionately argues for such rootedness in culture as essential for the human soul in order to enable us to be fully human. Uprootedness caused by modernity and mainstream schooling, on the other hand, lead to what Verrier Elvin agonized over and characterized as leading to a pathological state of loss of life in tribal people as they were assimilated into India's nameless, identityless, but enumerated below poverty line persons of the development state. Amrita's observations about the absence of tribal culture in government schools seems somewhat obvious and expected. What was unexpected, though, was her subsequent reflection that, in fact, the mainstream government school seemed to be culturally barren. It was not that it represented the culture of the majority group of that area. It just seemed to lack culture. The schools educated for literacy, numeracy, official curricular knowledge of science and history. Any culture that was found in the school was vestigial, incidental, sometimes serving a decorative purpose and annual performance, or in the hidden curriculum brought in by teachers. It seemed that it was there as an aspect of the private and unofficially there in the school, or at best, an attempt to recognize the value of local cultural practice following the need to celebrate cultural diversity as an integral and constitutive aspect of Indian society. Grounding in culture, that is community culture, that grounds and roots people, was not an official aim of education and not a part of the official curriculum. By now, you must be thinking of the counterfactuals from your experience that go against this claim that I have made, that mainstream schools are culturally barren, in that they do not provide grounding culture. I'm sure you know of several schools that propagate Hindu or Islamic or Christian culture as their stated mandate. There are various forms of nationalism and regionalism that pervade schools coming from state-mandated curricula. Is this not grounding? Is this not a grounding that is state-mandated? Aren't we concerned about the rightist tendency of wanting to ground all Indians in a state-mandated Hindu culture? Grounding in culture as a need of human formation has, by and large, been set aside as an aim of education in India. Recognition of culture and diversity of culture is, of course, well documented as an aim in education, and we find it in the NCF, that we must celebrate the diversity and the rich cultural heritage and diversity which we find in India. Acceptance and respect of a variety of cultures and cultural tastes in the ethos of the school is a well-articulated aim. However, by and large, we have followed a model in which being rooted in one's community culture is a part of the private realm, to be addressed in the home and in the community. Grounding in culture, which is the need for human formation, is seen as primarily the work of home socialization and acculturation, and not seen as a work of the school. School, on the other hand, is expected to keep its focus on epistemic educational aims and the formation of a public culture. The curriculum focuses on aims of literacy, numeracy, learning of science, history, geography, and the development of skills and capabilities, including physical skills. The NCF 2005, for example, extensively discusses the need to recognize local and indigenous cultures as repositories of knowledge that should become a resource in education. But this is primarily an epistemic focus. In other words, it is looking at cultural resources as resources of knowledge formation, not really seen as resources of grounding in culture. In its aim of education, it calls on the need to develop in all students the ability for cultural change, to critically re-engage and reinterpret the past. But this is also part of the formation of public culture that it advocates, looking at one's own culture and the ability to re-engage and reinterpret one's culture. There is the learning of epistemic and public values, such as autonomy, collaboration and learning, respecting equality and difference, listening to other people's point of views, requiring evidence for truth claims, being able to ask and receive explanations, negotiate differences, and achieve consensus. These values underline the practices of modern knowledge and the practices of modern democracy. These are the values that are associated with associated living in a pluralistic or multicultural context, producing the ability to have unity in diversity. This is an important idea, an important part of the idea of India and its associated public culture. So I'm not in any way denying the centrality and importance of this. However, the curriculum remains silent about the role of the school in forming identity with reference to specific constitutive culture of the diversity, leaving specific cultures to the realm of the private, even when one is being grounded into this common public culture and its associated national identity. The forms of nationalism, regionalism, the forms of majoritarian Hinduism that pervade the state and school systems are contesting views regarding the formation of the public culture. Nationalism and regionalism can be understood as attempts to consolidate the state's power over the individual and individual rights at the level of the nation or the level of the region. In majoritarian Hindutva, it is being claimed that the culture of the so-called majority should define the public culture. However, the distinctions that I am proposing between identity constituting culture, which I'm referring to as community culture, and public culture, which is also identity forming, but of a national identity, these are not distinctions that have official constitutional recognition, except where minorities are concerned. Only minority groups identified at the regional level are explicitly accorded cultural rights. The categories of minority language, minority religion, and culture of tribal people have been accepted as the basis of recognizing constitutive cultural rights and identity. The rest of Indian society seems to have been aggregated into a single whole. And here, culture, in its identity constituting sense, seems to cease to matter. The idea of public culture alone seems to be all that needs to matter, sufficient for the formation of society and also for human formation. Arguably, in order to achieve consensus on the characteristics that will define our public culture, the Indian constitution makers must have deliberately chosen to remain silent, or as Krishna Kumar puts it, mask many of the identity-forming, human-forming aspects of culture which reside in the realm of family and community, including contentious matters such as the status of and rights of women and children, which very likely were in conflict with the Constitution's own liberal framework. Arguably, all of these matters on which people were and are deeply invested and wish to maintain control and status quo at the level of community. However, public culture on its own is quite insufficient for human formation and for social formation. It's more akin to a set of general principles and values governing social relationships, interactions, and social justice. Human forming cultures are specific cultures, and humans become human within specific cultures, belonging to and identifying with particular cultures. For example, all of us speak language, but we speak specific languages, either Bengali or Tulu or Telugu. This is not to say that the common public culture is not important. After all, it characterizes how we relate to each other as individuals or as members of particular cultural groups in the public arena, and it is therefore necessary for a society, especially a liberal and multicultural society, to form and function. We need a public culture. The constitutional silence on the matter of non-minority culture or other cultures may have been politically necessary and seems to have been a strategically wise choice to enable the Indian state to form as a pluralistic democracy. To the extent that the Constitution is a socio-legal document, arguably it did not need to engage with this matter any more than it did. But as the Indian state has adopted a reformist and modernizing agenda for Indian society, that it is not merely overseeing social relationships, but it is actually forging and directing change in Indian society, therefore also forging this change in all these pluralistic constitutive cultures. And therefore the matter of the silence on the matter of the non-minority community cultures has problematic effects. At an obvious, superficial level, one of the problems that this invites is that it allows the view to gain ground that because it has to say something about protecting minority cultures, the state and the constitution don't care equally about the majority cultures which are not talked about, and in fact seems to disregard it. We will be justified in regarding this view as populist, motivated, political rhetoric that would not hold ground if we examine facts or had a mature understanding of why a liberal democracy with one majority group needs to have special legal protections for minorities. So it seems, but it is one of the problems. And we find this increasingly in populist rhetoric, that the fact that majority cultures are not spoken about means that the state doesn't care about them or wishes to extinguish them. However, a more substantive problem arising out of the silence with regards culture is in relation to the aims and the curriculum of compulsory schooling, which follows from the right to education. The right to education in the Indian Constitution has been read into the right to life with dignity. This enjoins on education the task of fully forming humans and giving them the enabling capabilities to live life with dignity. A conservative and minimal reading of this right could be that education should not do anything that takes away from a human life his or her dignity. And to that extent, recognition of and respect of a person's culture, community culture, constitutive culture, is essential and necessary. A more ambitious reading of the right to education could be that if culture is essential in human formation, then grounding a person in his or her culture is an essential task of education. This need not be read negatively as an uncritical grounding in a person's community culture, which could include unconstitutional values and practices of illiberal and restrictive identities. But it would require that even as individuals access the cultural achievements of humanity and grow into a new national culture, they are enabled to be fully human by being rooted in their own culture. This is no simple task, and it has its own problems. Gandhi, for example, had wanted the village community and its life to provide the core human forming culture. Ambedkar, on the other hand, rejected any proposal that would lead Dalits to be rooted in a hierarchical, oppressive culture of village communities while we wait for the oppressors to become enlightened. And what will constitute community? And whose culture would be recognized and accorded this human forming function? Will it be the caste groups? Will it be occupational groups or linguistic groups or geographic communities? Perhaps it does not matter which of these it is, as long as these are authentic communities with traditions and values, composed of a range of ages, generations, and knowledgeable members with a distinctive and recognizable form, with an attendant worldview and world-forming features and elements, dynamic and evolving as living cultures should be, integrated through activities and interdependencies involved with or affecting intergenerational cultural change. It's useful for us to remind ourselves that living cultures are not static cultures. They're not like some purest broth that you go into for some nutrition. They're actually evolving, dynamic, and changing all the time, and they're responding. And the members of these cultures define and reshape the culture. It's not only that cultures form you, but equally you form culture. So it's that kind of living culture that I'm referring to, and that Simone Weil or this argument is basically referring back to. This would require that education be spread and shared between school and such cultural communities, and that the right to education will have to extend beyond compulsory schooling to include grounding in one's own cultural community as a necessary aim for education. Going back to the tribal world, including the tribal life world of the tribal into the world of the school is non-trivial. The two worlds are epistemologically different from each other and engender different epistemic cultures. Epistemic meaning knowledge-related cultures. Aboriginal people in Australia who are seeking to ground children in their own culture while accessing modern school have actually solved this problem of incompatibility of cultures by creating what they call a two-way school or a split school as the only feasible solution. Children actually spend half the day in the school and half the day in the community's school. And they continue like that, like two parallel worlds. And that seems to be the only way in which they can give children equal access to both the modernizing cultural experiences of school and the rooting cultural experiences of community. If education and grounding culture is to be a part of the curriculum of compulsory education for all Indian children, then likely the institutional form of the school will need to be revisited and restructured to make it compatible with participating in culture and community activities and participating in school on the other hand. Shanta Sinha, however, has always been suspicious of any suggestion that the school calendar should be revised so that it coincides with the agricultural calendar, so that children have vacations when there is harvesting going on. She says that this carries the danger of propagating child labor. It's a valid concern. But perhaps community culture itself will have to be revisited and re-engaged with and oriented as suggested in the NCF. It's not as if community culture is just ready to take on this human forming function either. Equally, there's a concern as educationists of what are the practices of culture which will maximally be able to support this human forming function that we are attributing to it. What would such a grounding culture mean for children who attend schools like this one, like Vidya Shilp, and children whom we teach? Most of these children are from families who have migrated probably into the city, so it's not like they are a part of their own community. I don't know, could it be engagement with the mother tongue learning which produces that kind of grounding? Could it be that the school calendar should be structured so they and their families can go back to those communities from where they have come to re-engage with that community's life and its way of being, so that instead of having the terms the way we do, maybe one term is for community, is the community term, and children actually then go back and re-engage with the community. I don't know if the argument that I'm making carries some force and some value, and I personally believe it does, that I do think that a lot of the difficulties that we are experiencing as a society are largely related to the fact that we have not been able to recognize and accord our own cultures a kind of a living part of our own traditions. And we are always at loggerheads and tense about those who claim that they are doing it. We are unable to relate to our own cultures with confidence that we have not abandoned it and that we can also be speakers of our cultures. And I think if we have to regain that right, we have to regain our own authentic engagement with our community and allow it to contribute to the way in which we have formed as humans. So in conclusion, I want to leave you with this proposal and leave you with the questions that I feel arise, especially as we begin to think about what it means to integrate with community culture in for classes of people, social classes of people, especially middle classes, who seem to have migrated and moved way ahead in accepting modernizing cultures and public cultures as the key source of identity. Thank you.
You mentioned about the split school and all. Doesn't that increase the burden on a child? How do you expect a child to, cope up with such?
And how do you think we could make it less burdensome?
I don't know about that, but the idea that you have to learn both about your religion and community norms does increase.
Any curriculum requires you to prioritize and select because there's only so much time in which we have to do things. So if we decide that we only have 4 hours to spend in school and 4 hours that will be spent in community, we have to decide what we're going to do in these 4 hours. Not that we're going to load everything into the 4 hours that we were doing in an 8-hour school. Yeah? So it means that we have to return to the drawing board and select experiences which we regard as important in a compulsory curriculum which brings us to the school as an institution, and those experiences which we will have as members of the community. Yeah? So that's really how we would make it less burdensome.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us on the issue of culture and everything. But like you also mentioned that, it's dynamic and ever evolving and ever changing, and looking at culture as really a social construct. And, like you pointed here, most parents who've moved away from the local community, I'm just wondering if there is a need to sort of, also have to be grounded. I don't know what it any longer means to be grounded in the community culture, considering that, there's been so much, and we are also constantly on the move, and there is the community that, you're going to be associated with. It's not a permanent anymore. It's ever changing. So is there a need for I don't know what to call it, a universal culture, or some, maybe not culture, but have some values that sort of reflect culture? I'm just thinking out loud, really.
I think you're absolutely right that what we identify as community or culture, there can be, various ways in which we draw that circle to say this is culture and this is not this culture. So I think that's a difficult problem, and I don't claim any of us have the solution to it. However, the idea of a universal culture actually lacks the authentic character that community culture has, whatever that community is.
Right.
And as I was reflecting even on today's talk, I was thinking to myself, well, for me, would the fact that music has had a strong tradition in my family, would my association and growth into that musical community be a way in which I become grounded in one of the cultures that I have access to?
Right.
I think all of us have access to many cultures.
Right. Yes.
And we could probably be grounded in any one of them, or even more than one of them. We don't have to follow a rule that it has to be the caste group, it has to be the occupational group. But it must have the characteristics that authentic communities have.
Multicultural country like ours. So, do cultures divide or unite? And or is there any common ground where we could meet?
I think cultures actually do divide, because you can only be a member of this culture and not that. So the particularities seem to be divisive because they hinge on difference. Also, I think we don't have to be members of only one culture. I think we can be members of more than one culture. Probably we can't be members of 2 religious groups which are different from each other, but we can be members of a religious group and of a linguistic group and of an occupational group. We can have multiple identities of that kind, which are cultural identities. I think one of the problems of using a single matrix to define these cultures of belongingness is that they breed exclusivity and inward looking and make members of the other cultures othered and unrecognizable and different. I think that, it is a problem. We may say that traditional Indian society had a solution to that by expecting everybody to function within caste groups. I don't think the modern India that we have given ourselves wants us to function like that. And
Could
which
there
is
be a
why we are,
solution? Could there be a solution?
I think the public culture which is encoded in the constitution is a very important solution. It is a culture as well. It's not like it's not a culture. It's just that it's not adequate for human formation. But it is a very good basis for society formation, of enabling people to be able to live with each other. So the democratic values, for example, listening to each other, the need to arrive at consensus.
And teaching perspectives.
Teaching
global
perspectives, but we should remember that any value which is important to us, we are not going to change our mind about it easily. So it's foolish to think that I will make somebody change their values. I really have to figure out how we're going to prioritize if we had to choose.
No, it's
And we
just,
should be able to speak about that. It's not that I need to make you believe in what I believe in, because it's going to be impossible. You're never going to give up beliefs that you are committed to, right? So the ability to converse should not be based on commonality of values, but an agreement that we will engage with discussion in order to prioritize.
Yeah.
I think then we can find the means of discussion.
I think teaching diversity through perspective building, something like the subject that was now introduced in IGCSE called Global Perspective.
Yeah.
So in which you teach empathy and sympathy and looking at somebody else's perspective.
Absolutely. And in a way, recognizing that these are inalienable rights.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you don't have to like it, therefore. You don't have to like the other person's way of life. And that liking cannot be the only base of acceptance and respect of these rights.
That's very important.
That's really a problem, If you just start saying, everything's actually good. Well, some things are really not very good. But too bad. You don't have to do it. Yeah, I think we have to kind of have the maturity that the ability to live together will not come out of homogeneity of values.
Hello, ma'am. Ma'am spoke of global perspective. Now we are knowing ourselves as citizens of the world and not moreover our own communities. Do you believe should we have a revival of our cultures again? Because now I believe they're fading away as globalization is taking steps ahead.
In fact, what is happening in globalization is the local community is reasserting itself in very retrogressive ways. And those of us who have said we are global citizens no longer can interact with our community as authentic members of the community. When we try to speak in our community to say, look, there's another point of view, people just shut us up saying, look, you've left us long ago. You don't belong to us, so we're not going to hear you anymore. So we have forfeited the right to engage in our community by saying we are these global citizens. But actually, it's a kind of a rootless global citizenship. And in my view, we can be much more confident as global citizens if we are rooted. And that doesn't mean that we have to accept everything which is in our culture, but we have to gain the right to reject it by becoming it. Yeah? As a member of the community, I can refuse to do some things. Yeah? As a member of the community, I can choose not to be jacketed into a particular role which women had, and debate with others who are forcing that identity on other members in my community. But if I leave the community, I no longer have this role and influence in my community. So I feel that reclaiming that space is very essential for the community to remain alive. Otherwise, it goes back to some mythical, pure community state, which is kind of a dead thing of the past. And it doesn't have the human forming potential that it has.
Ma'am, you said that community culture is needed I can understand why it's needed for the community to grow, but I'm struggling with understanding why it's needed for human formation.
The sense of self and who am I is a very core human concern. So even when you run away with your culture, when you return to it, when you return to yourself, it is impossible not to see your communities of origin often in that part of the narrative. Now, self evolves. It's not like it's stagnating. And we live in multiple communities. We don't live in one. So even while you reject one, it's not like you're rejecting everything. You will also find and you will search for communities where you will feel you can grow. And the thing about community is that it's actually social, it's material, and it's psychological in a very deep way. It is only when you are a member of the community that you feel motivated to act in the world and do things in the world. Without it, so it has this orienting kind of function that it gives to you. And that's really what culture does. That's really what, and it's impossible to actually realize this as an individual. That's what it means to say that humans are social. It's not just we are social in a general sense, but we are social in a particular sense. We speak particular languages. We like particular forms of art. We speak with particular accents. So it's the particularities that define ultimately who we are. And often we encounter people and feel, oh, they're confused. That's really because you're not really figuring out where you belong, what defines you. And belongingness is not a static thing. It's not a binding thing. It need not be. Some versions of the theory of belongingness is that it is binding and static, but I'm very much of the view that culture with a small c is actually constitutive and evolving and not static and binding.